Yeah, welcome everybody. I'm really happy that I can join the conference still today. As I was saying a minute ago to some of the others, I've been in class all day, not with the Fresh Connection, by the way. I'm co-hosting a training here in Paris, in France, together with another lecturer who is playing the Blue Connection. And I'm doing sort of the sessions around the game with him. So in a way, you could say it's a pretty similar experience as I will hopefully be able to transmit to you in the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. This masterclass is about how to get the richest and most engaging in-class value chain experience. So basically what I've tried to do is to try and capture in a way the way I go about my own courses. Let me briefly start by introducing myself. I see some familiar names appearing here, so I know some of you, but there's also some new names for me that we have never met before, probably. My name is Ed Weenk. I'm from the Netherlands with a background in business administration. I have a professional doctorate from Eindhoven University of Technology. And I started working in the logistics industry. I moved to Spain for the company I was working for at the time. And about 3-4 years into Spain, I left the company. I stayed there. We stayed there, I should actually say, because we went there together, my wife and me. We stayed in Spain, and I basically started working as a freelancer, what I still do today in a way. And I divide my time over teaching, consulting, and business gaming has been a constant also there since, I would say, 2008, 2009-ish, for sort of, I think. Just for you as a point of reference, this is an educative conference, so let me focus a bit on the teaching part. I think I dedicate probably 60-70% of my time to teaching. I work a lot with business schools around the world, so I deal a lot with MBA programs, executive MBA programs, some specialized master programs, but most of it is really in connection to people who sort of finished their university studies already, or they are even already having a large trajectory in practice. That as a frame of reference, because it might not be 100% the same as your frame of reference, I do work a lot together with InChange. I do give a lot of support to teachers who want to use the simulation games, for example. So I do have a lot of contact with people in universities of applied sciences. So I'm more than familiar with those settings as well. I actually had the pleasure only a few weeks ago to play the Blue Connection in a high school, 18-year-old kids, which was great fun, I have to say. A totally different environment, but was good fun for a change. 3 days in a row, and as far as the teachers, their regular teachers were telling me, the kids stayed with great concentration until the very end, and they said it to me like in a way of a surprise. So I guess that was also what gamification can do, because we did actually use a business game. I've written a few books. 2 of those actually have to do with the business games of InChange, the Fresh Connection, the Blue Connection. I will talk a little bit about that later on, but not too much. I have a YouTube channel. I'm not a YouTuber, by the way, but I have a YouTube channel. I publish some videos there, basically for my own students, but I thought I might as well open it up for everybody that has an interest in seeing some of those. So they're basically background videos to the things I do in class, born obviously out of this COVID crisis, where I need to save some time inside my sessions. So I said, okay, let me just prepare some videos, then they can look at that outside. All right, so to the session of today, a rich and engaging experience, in this case about value chain management or supply chain management. And this is what I would sort of capture under the name of integrated learning approach. And what I would like to do in the coming minutes is to explain to you what I mean with this integrated learning approach. It's something that I've always sort of been doing as long as I've been in teaching in this way, but I only sort of formulated this in a way, sort of what does it actually consist out of? About 2 years ago, in a conversation with the guys at InChange, we thought, okay, and maybe we can sort of establish a connection between the teaching approach and the games, so to speak, because they're pretty well connected. But let's try and formulate what that actually consists out of. And we dubbed that the integrated learning approach. And I've tried to put on paper in a way what that is about. And anyway, my classes were there first. The integrated learning approach, the formalized version of that, let's say, came afterwards. But obviously now it's an input also to my new courses, because I keep developing new courses all the time. And now it's also for me a checklist. No, did I actually tick all the boxes that I did before intuitively? Right? It's become now a more explicit list of points that I want to keep in mind. So this integrated learning approach, obviously it starts at the end with the audience, no? Because in the end, that's the people who I do this for. As I always say to my students, and I explicitly tell them this, by the way, is that it's not about me teaching, it's about them learning. And with that, I'm trying to also transmit a message already up front to the students that their learning is not measured by the amount of time that I speak. I mean, because that's very different from traditional lecturing, where basically you are supposed to be talking all the time as a teacher. And I have never ever done that in my classes since the beginning. But I still notice that not all students are familiar with that or comfortable with it. So I need to explicitly tell them that that's going to be the case, right? That they don't expect me to be talking all the time, because I will not do that. So I transmit that already upfront. But it starts with the learners. So obviously any course design starts with that. For whom is this mentioned or meant? No, who is the target audience in this case? And I'll come back to that a little bit later in a little bit more detail. And then I formulated sort of the generic goals that I basically use for all of my courses. I didn't mention that before, but I do a lot of basic operations and supply chain courses. But I also do circular economy courses, I do entrepreneurship courses, I do strategy courses, I do project management courses. There's a wide variety of things, and those generic goals are pretty much the same always, right? And later on I make them specific for a specific course. And I would like to go through some of these elements here in the list. So first of all, the first generic goal is my courses need to be meaningful and relevant to the ones who are in the classroom. And the first thing I do to achieve that is by linking to the learner's perspective, of course, the student's perspective. And the first thing I do normally at the very beginning of a course is to link to other courses that they see. Right? Because then I see, okay, my course is relevant to you because it also links to other courses that you're in, right? To establish cross links. And I do that at the very beginning in the introduction already. So that they are aware of the fact that, hey, this is going to be interesting because it links to other things we're doing in the same program. Then, in addition to that, meaningful and relevant, and I bring it in also a dimension of whatever I'm teaching is not only about now, it's also about what the future may look like, right? So I need to make the content of the training relevant also into the future, that I hopefully students will see that what they learn is not only useful now, but it can help them move into the future. So basically, I do two things there. First of all, I always try to link to things from media. What I read in the newspaper, what I saw on the internet, was on the news, and connect that to the topics of my course. And I do that pretty much in every session. Obviously, that's a lot of work because I need to make sure that not only do I read the news and the newspapers and the news on the radio, but that they also put it into the courses, of course. Because as you can imagine, if you put stuff from a newspaper or a website on your slides, this may get outdated fairly fast, right? So this is something that I continuously try to keep up. And then, as you see the example on the screen there, the VUCA world, Industry 4.0. As a topic, it's not getting so much outdated, but this is actually a slide, not from an innovation course, which I sometimes also do. This is from an operations and supply chain course, because I do want to, at the end of the course, when we've sort of covered all the fundamentals, the basics of operations and supply chain, then I would say, okay, let's shake the tree, guys. So now this context of the VUCA world and Industry 4.0, what would the supply chain in the future look like then? And let's put it in the context of new things. And I have exercises to support that, teams to work on it, or individually as a paper, for example, right? So, and this is making the course relevant, because what we do in class links to what they also see on the news, right? And this is, I think, a very powerful mechanism to keep people interested. Not that this is not just about stuff from a book. No, it's actually linking to things that they hear around them, right? So that's the part about meaningful and relevant, and not only for now, but also for the future, the crystal ball, so to speak. In addition, there's a few other things. I want people to feel the complexity. Now, many of the classes I deal with, many of the courses I deal with, have a certain amount of complexity in terms of the topic, I mean, and I've come to the conclusion already quite long ago that you can explain to people that something is complicated, but that doesn't mean that they truly capture how complicated that actually is. I need to put them in the situation that they feel how complicated it is by, for example, putting them in charge of the problem, and then tell me, okay, what are you going to do with this, for example? That also relates to knowledge and skills, in the sense that I'm not so interested actually, and in that sense, I'm not really an academic, I imagine, but I'm not so interested so much in that people tell me or show me that they know the theory. I'm much, much more interested that they can apply the theory and make meaningful decisions or come up with meaningful ideas, right? And that they need the theory in order to do that. That's perfectly fine. I don't shy away from theory. And I'm also not saying that I think theory is nonsense. No, it's not. But I would prefer not to spend too much time on theory in my classes. I many times say to my students, if you want theory, go to the library. And if you want my tips on which books to go for, I will help you. And if you have questions about that, do raise them. But I'm not going to spend a lot of my time in class talking about theory. I want you to feel the complexity, and I want you to be training your skills about how to apply the theory. Yeah, and because then we're actually getting somewhere. And then there's this other thing about individual and team activities. I always, by design, want my courses to be a mix of individual stuff and team stuff. Individual is also a little bit out of necessity sometimes, I have to say, because whether I like it or not is not so relevant, actually. In many schools, obviously, there has to be an individual part in the grading. And normally that's actually the majority. So I need to have individual activities then in order to be able to do that, right? If that would not have been the case, I probably would have had much less individual activities as part of my courses, because yeah, the norm nowadays is many times teamwork, right? So teamwork is also a skill that you need to train. In companies, obviously, you typically don't choose your project teammates. You need to train the skill of being able to deal with a wide variety of people, including the ones that you really don't like so much, right? Because in real life, that will happen continuously. And that, I think it's a skill to be trained, to be aware of that, to know how you deal with that, and to also know your own strengths and weaknesses in that, that you can recognize those things up front. So I would prefer to have a lot of team activities in there, where students can train that, right? I normally ask program managers of the programs that I do my courses in, that they make specific teams for my course, preferably in a composition that doesn't exist yet, so that they work in teams that they have never been working in before, so that they mix up the teams, right? Why? Again, this is also a bit shaking up the tree, right? In a sense that because many programs work with fairly stable teams throughout a whole year or throughout a semester, and I want that to be a little bit different. That they also learn how to deal with different teammates. And it's interesting to see, because one of the things I always do is to ask them to write a reflection paper afterwards on the basis of a number of specific questions I ask. And that feedback normally, or that comment appears. Yeah, I was in a new team and we didn't know how to work together. And then I said, that's precisely what I wanted. Because and not to be miserable to them. No, that's not the point. The point is that they practice how to work with people that you don't know, which is something that will happen, of course, many occasions, right? So I will always blend a mix of team activities and individual activities. And I always normally try to do one team activity during the course in which I change them around again, right? And I will come to one of those examples later on. There's less pressure on that, so there's less tension, but I do want to do that to break the routine a little bit, so to speak. Good, so really this is about experiential learning, right? Putting you in the driving seat rather than just listening to me telling stuff. And you can do that in many forms or shapes, of course, with exercises, with the simulation, which I will come to in a few moments. Then the engaging and fun. I put that always as a goal. I want to force myself to explicitly think about this. Okay, is this engaging enough? Is this fun enough? No, because at the end of the day, we're not only there to learn, but it's also good to have a bit of a good time at the same time. No, we're going to be spending quite a number of hours in class together. So let's make it at least as enjoyable as possible. And the thing I try to do there is to motivate students for the course, partly through the content, so the meaningful and relevant I was mentioning before, that they really sort of, oh, this is going to be interesting and useful, so that they're motivated through that part, but at the same time motivated also through the methodology I'm using, right? So I choose for a wide diversity of content, different topics, right? All related, of course, to the relevant to the students in question. And part of the methodology is, for example, a simulation game. In this case, the Fresh Connection as an example, since we're talking about courses about value chain or supply chain. The interesting thing about the simulation game is that it actually meets a number of these goals in one go, right? I would always be hesitant to have an entire course just with the game. For me, it will become a little bit too dominant then. Oh, the course is about playing a game. No, that's always a message that I also give, by the way, to students. This course is not about playing a game. We're going to be using a game, yes, but this is not about playing the game, right? The course is about something else, and we're going to be using the game in order to learn about that particular topic. But what is definitely the case is, for example, feel the complexity. That's what the game does. You're in the driving seat of a virtual company with colleagues, by the way, so it's also a team activity in which you have to find a way to deal with your colleagues and agree with them under time pressure. So that's a very powerful feature, of course, of the simulation. At the same time, the simulation is a good expression of complexity, and how to deal with complexity. Once again, I can explain that that supply chain is complex stuff, and I can tell that 10,000 times, but I give them 1 hour in the simulation game, and then they really understand what I was trying to say, right? And that is very powerful, obviously. And then in addition to that, and that relates really also to the engaging element of it, gamification works. As soon as there's competition, they will pay attention because they want to win. I mean, it's as simple as that, right? And it's quite interesting. I will, maybe come back to that a little bit later, but I have never, ever used the results of the game in my grading, never, ever. And still the gamification works. It's that the purpose for me is not to use the results in the grading, but the competition element absolutely works. Independent from that, my students know that they will not be graded on the results of the game, but still they want to win, and that's a very powerful feature, I think, in there. Maybe as a side step, since it comes up here, otherwise the question will probably come later anyway. Why don't I use the results of the game in the grading? And I know that a lot of people actually do this. So if you're comfortable with that, you've experienced with it, please keep on doing that. It's not that I have something against it. But it just, for me, it doesn't work. And the main reason for that is that I truly believe that the result of the game is a very mediocre expression at best of how much somebody has learned, actually. And for me, the grading should be about how much somebody has learned. And you see different behaviors in teams sometimes, no? And then there's the team that wants to take risk. You know, they say, okay, let's just try out stuff, and then they fail, but they learn from it. The result is a disaster, but they've actually learned something important. Okay, so I'm going to penalize them for that. My opinion is no, I shouldn't. Right? I actually prefer the team who takes chances and maybe fails, rather than the team that plays it safe because they know that the result of the game will go into the grade. You know, I mean, this is, for me, at least, for me, it's very clear. In any case, having said that, I know that there's plenty of people who for years have been using this in the grading. If they're happy with that, who am I to say that you shouldn't? But I have a very clear opinion about why I at least don't do this in this particular way, right? Back to the topic. So the motivation is through the content. If my content is relevant and the students know it's relevant, they will pay attention, at least more than in other cases. And of course, the methodology. If you keep the course dynamic, and at the same time, for example, the simulation helps in that, you get the engagement, right? They will stay in there. Good. So then I get to the next step, which is actually the course design. Yeah, so I have these generic goals, and now it's about the design of the course itself. And there's a number of points there. First of all, I always give my courses an overarching storyline, always. And so all of the courses I mentioned have a storyline, right? And in the operations and supply chain courses, my overall storyline is the stories of what and how and simple but not easy. Those are the two main storylines in my course. What and how, for me, expresses, well, in a company, there's people out there promising stuff. Let's call them the commercial guys, no, the marketing and sales guys. They go out and define what the market wants and start promising publicity and approaching people, etc. So that's the what side. What are we promising? And then, of course, the next step is, okay, but how do we do this? No, because once you generated an expectation in the market with your clients, you need to live up to that, because otherwise you would be lying to them, basically, right? So you don't want that. So that's the what and how. And this is a message that I emphasize in every single session. And that gives coherence to the course, right? Because it's a message that will be repeated. And the second part is the simple but not easy. Most of the theory I touch upon, or the frameworks or concepts that I touch upon in my courses, it's all not rocket science, really. You know, it's not rocket science. Talk about inventories, it's not rocket science. Talk about transportation, it's not rocket science. The thing is, the complexity of supply chain, of course, is that it's all of those things at the same time. And now it becomes complicated. It's not that the individual topics maybe are so incredibly complicated, but it's the sum of it. And in reality, of course, we have everything at the same time always, right? And once again, that's where the game is extremely helpful to bring that message across. No? Students, when they play the game of their own individual decisions, they can typically make sense of that in some way or another. No, it may take them some time, but they will find out. But the complexity, of course, is my decision takes place in the context of many decisions that other people are taking at the same time. And that's the true complexity, right? And once again, that's a challenge of explaining, no? Because if I explain it in the words that I was just using, most people would say, yeah, okay, sounds logical, makes sense. Yeah, but that's not enough. You know, I want something more out of it. And the game helps there. Because then after a round of gameplay, then I can say, you see what I mentioned with simple but not easy? You start feeling this now. And then I insist, and it comes back and back and back. No, so that's the overarching storyline. And as I said, for all of my courses, I have an overarching storyline, always. My courses are stories. I frame them that way. No, so it's not that the different sessions that I do, I frame them as, well, okay, the topic of session 2 is this, and the topic of session 3 is this. No, it's just what and how, simple but not easy, chapter 2. I mean, this is the way I frame it. No, this is the way I tell the story. The next point in here is about learning objectives and evaluation. And there, basically, and I hinted at that a little bit at the very beginning, it really depends on who am I dealing with, right? So there is an audience. That's the first question. For whom is this? Now, what kind of audit? Is this an MBA program? Is this a pre-grad or an undergrad program for people without working experience? That's very different. My learning objectives are different. I want them to learn. It's maybe the same topic, yes, but the learning objectives are slightly different, right? The program they're in, is this a specialized program? Is this a generalist program? It's slightly different, right? Then, of course, very important as well is how many classes and hours do I actually have, right? And are those sessions together? And like this week, I'm in France teaching, it's 3 days in a row. That's a very condensed format. Yeah, so I have very little opportunity to have students do stuff between sessions because I see them every day. And there is not so much time between sessions, right? If you have weekly sessions, that's already completely different. Okay, if we have a week in between, well, actually that gives an opportunity to do something in between. I can actually even ask them to play a round of the game between 2 classes and not having to dedicate time in the classroom for that, for example, which is quite interesting, by the way, as a learning objective, if you want that as a learning objective, no? To have them experience playing together in a classroom, to have them play outside the classroom and they just organize themselves, and to have them compare the experience. Because it's really different, right? Because sitting together is easy. Everything is easier. You just have to turn around and say something to your colleague and it's done, right? If you're not together, you pick up the phone and the other person is not available. Okay, now we're entering into a completely different dynamic, which is quite interesting, right? To later on have the reflection. So how did you deal with that? How did you come to an agreement? And by the way, what did you do when your colleague didn't show up? Yeah, in the classroom, that's evident, but outside the classroom, it's not so evident. Now how you deal with that. In any case, so that's about the number of classes and hours. The other part, of course, is the duration itself. How long is the course lasting? Is this 3 days, or is it a month, or what else it could be? And the third thing is, of course, the platform. Is this a face-to-face class? Is this a 100% online class? Is it a blended course with a bit of everything? And that all has different implications in terms of the learning objectives, in terms of the course design, of course, as well. Could even be the evaluation, right? It's all slightly different. So I find it a bit difficult to say something about that in generic terms, because there's a wide diversity. What I do want to say in terms of evaluation and well, let's call it grading, I mean, basic word maybe. The more junior the students are, the more little graded assignments I will typically have. Whereas if I work with executive MBAs, for example, so that's people between 35 and 55 years old, they have a bunch of working experience, they know why they do the program, some of them invest in it themselves, so they absolutely know what they're doing, and they take it seriously typically. No, so they're very self-motivated in that sense. So if I give those a feedback or an instrument that they can use to analyze their own results in the game, as an example, I can pretty much count on it that they will use it to their advantage if they see the point. Yeah, and I can leave it up to their own judgment to do that. If I work with junior students, I cannot trust that they do that. At least that's my experience, no? Whereas maybe they will not actually use it because they don't really capture what it's about, or they feel it's useless, or it's a stupid teacher who says it, so it must be nonsense, or whatever the reason can be. But then I cannot trust that they do it. And of course, if I give them the tool, I do that with a reason, right? So there I might actually ask them to say, okay, prepare it, use the tool, but send the results in, and that goes into the grading. Yeah, and the grading of that is normally fairly quick, yeah, because those are fairly straightforward tools, but then at least I know that they paid attention to it, right? And it enters into the grading, and you can connect that to rubrics if you need to, with much more and more schools are having also nowadays. So that's about the learning objectives and the evaluation. And then, of course, the final design of the individual sessions, right? Where I normally make a scheme, hour by hour, block by block, what's the main topic I want to address, what's the type of exercise I want to do. And basically what I do there is blend in topics and methodology, right? And the topics, as I mentioned before, that's basic theory and concepts, always to a certain extent. So that's the usual things in operation supply chain, of course, capacity, flexibility, inventories, transportation, well, the whole thing. But also different perspectives on the topic, right? I want to link to sales, I want to link to HR, I want to link to finance. So have different views on the same topic, even though we're in an operations course. I find it very interesting to talk about, okay, so why is this also relevant for the salespeople? So that if you have a conversation with the salespeople, or you turn out to be the salesperson later on, that you have an understanding about why this is also relevant to you in a certain way. And as I mentioned also earlier on, I always want to bring in elements of future trends. Not talk about the basics now. No, how will those, what will they look like placed in the context of future developments? And then in terms of methodology, I typically use a wide diversity, no? So when I started doing teaching, I'm talking about 2004, so that's almost 18 years ago by now. That was in a business school in Spain, where I was living at the time, and they basically had the case method philosophy. Everything was case method, basically. Now, every class, every day would be 4 hours of class, typically in the morning, with the MBAs at least. Which means one case in the 2 hours before the break, one case in the 2 hours after the break. And that would be sort of the whole year. So they would be doing 150, 175 cases throughout the year. That was basically the model there. And what I at least decided for myself over time is, I need to bring in a bit more diversity. Not because the cases are not useful, because I really like cases. I mean, I think they're extremely useful. And the more open-ended they are, the better. Right? Because that challenges the thinking of the students, but only cases is a bit too mono method in a way. You understand what I mean. I need a bit diversity, because diversity also pushes the engagement. Basically, that's a bit the idea. So I use cases in my classes. I use the simulation that sort of runs through the whole course. But there's also little exercises and reflections inside the course or after the course, right? So let me just give you a bit of an example. So basically, summing it up, overarching storyline, and then a blend of learning styles, as according to Kolb's learning cycle, for example, a blend of learning styles. So not only read, but also do, but also reflect on what you did. All these different methods, reflect on what somebody else did and give them feedback. All these different things, I'm trying to blend those in some way or another into the course, right? Because that makes the dynamic of the course also a bit different, in the sense that there's different types of activities, team activities, individual activities, short activities, longer activities, different methodologies, and that keeps it sort of alive. No? And that's what I'm after. And it's, by the way, at the same time, also more fun for me as a teacher, to have a diversity of things, which is also important. I also spend a lot of time there, so I try also to make it a bit fun for me, of course. I mean, that's obvious. But that works also a bit in that way. So I will just give you a brief example of what I would maybe do in a standard operations and supply chain course. So I would ask the students up front to do a bit of reading or watch some of those videos, for example. But for example, if I know that I'm going to be playing the fresh connection, I might actually ask them to individually do a mapping exercise. Create a value chain diagram, a flow chart, and populate that with data from the system, focused on the role that they're going to play in the game. Just their own role, the sales function or the purchasing function, doesn't matter which role. And I ask them to send that in. Goes into the grading. Okay, so I already have one box for the grading ticked. And they can do that individually before the course, no problem whatsoever. And the mapping exercise, of course, is documented, so I can just point to the document, and they can pretty much do that on their own. So that's great. So I already have one graded activity. By the way, at the same time, they have familiarized themselves with the screens of the game. I don't need time for that in the session anymore, which is absolutely wonderful, right? And of course, during that time, I'm available for questions. If somebody would say, yeah, I can't find this piece of information or whatever. Okay, obviously, I will answer them. It's not to get them confused. That's not the objective. But then already have done some things. And then I have the in-class experience. So this is an example of a 4-day course, for example. Doesn't really matter if it's 4 days in a row or 4 days with time in between. And you can see that there's a mix of things. So everything in dark blue is basically introductions on my side. Everything in light blue are group activities. Everything in this sort of brownish color is gameplay. And so there's a mix of things going on. And normally, as you can see, after every round of gameplay, there is a link. That's the debrief, where I link the experience in the gameplay to a piece of theory or some concepts from the theory. And that's the powerful thing. I mean, I always like to say the simulation, the round of gameplay is the excuse to get to the debrief, right? Because in the debrief, that's where I connect the dots. I don't connect the dots during the gameplay. No, in the gameplay, the students are working. No, I don't interfere there if I don't have to. So I need those debriefs to actually connect the dots to the theory, because that's also when the students start seeing that the theory actually makes sense, because they see it happen in the game. But I need to tell them a little bit, but there is this concept in theory. Well, here you have it. Did you see? Now use that to your advantage in the next round of gameplay. We're sort of building it up, right? As you can see in day 3, for example, the second part of day 3, there's this exercise, best practices per role. Now, I told you before, sometimes I mix up the teams a bit. So I say, well, all the salespeople together, all the purchasing people together from the teams, etc. And then I have this best practices exercise. So they mix up the teams. That changes the dynamic a little bit of the session. They're certainly surrounded by peers in a way. It's like going to a conference and you meet with people who are doing the same job, right? So they can complain a bit collectively about their colleagues in the team, and then, but I have some serious questions as well for them to address, right? And that tends to be a very useful exercise. I get always very positive feedbacks from the students about that. It was actually quite nice to talk to the other sales guys, the other teams, right? Which is quite interesting to observe. And as you can see on the last day of the course, I have this topic around the VUCA world, for example. And I connect that to the game, actually. So there is no VUCA module in the game, no. But that doesn't mean that I cannot put that into the perspective of the game. So I have this exercise in which I ask, I bring the CEO of the Fresh Connection, I bring that figure back into the picture. Bob is back, right? And then suddenly he's addressing the students. Thank you for helping me turning around the company. But as you can imagine, that's not the end point. That's just the beginning. No, because the only thing we did is we get the company back on track, but that's not the final point. No, we need to go into the future now. And then I have this sort of phrased questions about Industry 4.0. What would that mean to us with the COVID crisis? Make me a risk plan. Talk about the VUCA world. I mean, what do you see as the most important trends that we need to prepare for, and these kinds of things. So you can basically develop that into many different directions. And what it does, and that's quite interesting, of course, once again, it places, the gameplay experience with a virtual company, simplified company, suddenly in the context of the stuff that they read in the newspaper. And that's interesting. Right? And also at the same time, this is leading up to something that I typically ask afterwards as the post-course activity. I normally ask students to write a paper about a company, a real company, right? And I ask them the same thing. So what would this company need to do in terms of making their supply chain prepared for the VUCA world, Industry 4.0, and things like that? Right. So once again, this is the outlook into the future from the perspective, in this case, of starting with the game experience. Now you build the case around the situation in the game as a step up for then applying it to another company. And of course, that's the advantage of working with executive MBAs or MBAs, because they typically do their degrees part-time and they work at the same time, so they can write about their own company, for example. And that's, of course, very interesting, because then not only do they do something for a grade, but at the same time, they're doing something useful for the company, in a sense. So basically, in a nutshell, that's really what I try to do. So the way I go about my my course designs and with the principles behind that, and to try and make it engaging. A few closing things, and then I think we can sort of go to Q&A. What I've tried to do, I'm actually working on that still, it's an evolving document still, is to capture all of this in a document, right? So it's like a guideline in a sense, call it a script if you like, but the way I build my, and I wrote this for myself at one point in time, of course, but here's to say, yeah, well, you might as well share it with others. I mean, it's not a secret in there. And I also link, for example, to chapters in the book, to videos I prepared, and it's all sort of there as a package, as a logical flow. No? So if you would be interested in that, I have no problem in sharing that whatsoever. I don't discard, by the way, the option that this will become at some point in time part of the education materials of InChange, because it links also to the simulation game in some way or another. And if that's the case, it might actually be available on the InChange platform at some point in time. Yeah. So basically, this whole integrated learning approach, also what we try to do is capture that in the book Mastering the Supply Chain, which I was invited to write by the guys at InChange, and I said, yeah, I appreciate your request, but I'm not going to write a manual for the game. No, I want to make it something bigger than just that. And I think between all of us, because of course InChange also helped with parts of it, we really achieved to make something interesting there. Not only about supply chain, the technical side, but also talk about the leadership dimension, talk about the business dimension, and linking all of that directly in some way or another to the gameplay. So I think it's a really powerful approach. In a way, my way of looking at the book is really the integrated learning approach captured on paper, right? It's if you're interested, by the way, if you are a lecturer, and I imagine that then that should be not a problem. You can reach out to the people at InChange to request an inspection copy of the book if you are interested. Okay, so then please know that that's possible. They will ask for some data from you, because that's what they need to pass on also to the publishing company, obviously. But the option definitely exists. Stephen, I see your question. I will come to that in a few moments. Then lastly, I wrote a white paper about this integrated learning approach. It's pretty much the same message as what I try to share here, but then also captured on paper. You can find a link to that on the website of InChange. And we did sort of a masterclass already before. It's slightly different than what I did now. Here I focus a little bit more on course content, also in the comments I made, but these resources are available. So basically wrapping up, I mean, for me, the integrated learning approach, and particularly to make the experience rich and engaging, is first of all, relevant topics. Make sure that your course is relevant to your students. They need to understand why it is relevant to them. And again, by linking to stuff from the newspaper, by linking to the other courses they are doing, that will make it clearer to them, of course. No, you can never have 100% success rate, probably, with all of your students. No, but if you capture most of them, that's already quite something, right? Blend of perspectives, look at it from different angles. That refreshes also the mind of the students, I believe. And the last thing is a blend of methodologies, also to keep it alive, to keep the dynamic changing every once in a while, to do something surprising once in a while in the middle where they don't expect it. You don't have to communicate everything up front, right? You can just mention the topic, but don't say how you're going to deal with the topic, and then launch something interesting which catches them a bit by surprise. And you can definitely do that. So that's basically what I had to share with you. So I hope it's been interesting. I would propose to open the round of questions. And then, Stephen, I would like to start with your question. You raised it in the chat box. How do you get students to look beyond ROI? You say your students get over-focused on ROI sometimes, and they miss a lot of the other key concepts. Well, one of the things basically is that I let them know very clearly that I will publish the results after every round. Actually, I make that into a little bit of a show, a bit of suspense in there, you know, by publishing the results and step by step, etc., because the gamification element absolutely works. However, they know upfront because the question, I mean, well, the more junior the students are, the earlier in the first session, the question comes up, how are we going to be graded? Basically, I let them know upfront, I'm not going to use the ROI in the grading, period, end of story. So, you know, if they then still want to focus on the ROI, that's up to them. But I will tell them that I will focus all of the graded activities on the content and not on the ROI. And that should be very clear to them. And if then they, again, still decide to deviate from that and focus on the ROI, that's their choice. I mean, I don't mind, but I told them, and I will, you know, I insist on it also if they ask. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Ed. Yeah. Other questions maybe from other people? No questions. Then I have been too clear. How do I grade them then? Yes, of course. I was waiting for that. No, thanks for the question. So as I showed you in the example, I can put it back on the screen here. Okay, so here. So I have this activity up front, the value chain mapping individually. Prepare that on the basis of your role, and that goes to me, and that's graded. And I do that even with MBAs, for example. Or with executive MBAs. I mean, that's independent from sort of the level and the age of the students. Then what I do during the course depends really on the more junior they are. So you see here in the scheme a number of group exercises, those in light blue, and some of them I may actually ask them to send it in to me. Okay, so as soon as I can see on the school's learning platform that all the group exercises have been uploaded, I continue the session. And those can be graded. With executive MBA students, I don't do that. Okay, I have other grading things. And then you see the post-course TFC reflection paper and a company paper. That's typically what I do at the end of the course. Yeah, and that typically does the trick. Yeah, the company paper is for me important because I would really like, especially with the more senior students, I would really like them already to apply what they learned to a context which is not the game, for example, or not the cases that we discussed in class. No, I want really to have them apply that in their own environment, and particularly with people who work during their studies, which is with part-time MBAs, part-time executive MBAs, of course, always the case. They really appreciate that they can actually take the opportunity to link it to what they see in the company. And many of those are not experts in operations or supply chain because they work typically in another area. So for them, it's quite revealing what they find then, what they can talk about with their colleagues. So that's really interesting for them. Yeah, so I not only make the assignment just because we need one for the school. No, I try to make it interesting also for them, that they actually learn something from it. Yeah. This week, as I told you, this week I'm teaching in France, and I was asked to actually design a multiple choice exam. I think I completely failed in making the exam because the colleagues said, "Okay, we'll finish it for you." I hate multiple choice exams, and that was demonstrated by what I delivered to them. So that's not for me. I mean, I don't think the world is black and white, and I actually, you know, in the book, those of you who know the book, you know it. The others, if you get your hands on the book, you can see it. The book has more than 80 different exercises in it, and they are all open-ended. And that's precisely the point. At least for me, that's precisely the point. I want people to think and to come up with answers for themselves and then discuss it with them, right? Let me see. Martin, you ask a question, and then Ola, you have another question, a follow-up question. I will get to that in a second. What has been the student feedback, and how do you build that into your course design? Can you elaborate a little bit, Martin? Maybe you can open up your microphone, just for me to understand the question well.
Hello. What I mean is that I don't know if you normally have this. Certainly we have it in our programs that there are questionnaires that students complete, or that there is sort of short-term feedback from students saying what they like, what they don't like, what works for them, what doesn't work for them.
Yeah.
And invariably that to us as educators is very valuable to maybe adjust or readjust or, as you say, to keep this engagement, excitement going.
Yeah, sure.
That you need to maybe rethink the
Yeah,
actual
that's
design
true.
of your program.
Yeah,
so from your integrated approach, is that something that is part of its design? Is it part of your sort of mindset that you say, okay, you know, this has worked, this doesn't work, this is what I rethink, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that would be common sense to approach it that way. But there's another thing into it as well, which is, I mean, as I told you, I work as a freelancer, so I work with a lot of different schools to whom I don't have a fixed relationship. I mean, it's recurring, right? But I'm not on their payroll. I'm not part of their fixed staff. Yes, they all have their feedback loops, and typically that's quite direct with the program directors, right? Who have an interest in keeping their students happy. But I'm also quite happy myself in the sense that they are also a moderating factor, right? Because what in my experience, the moment when students are asked to provide those feedbacks are very different sometimes. Sometimes it's even in the emotion of the scores of the final round, for example, right? Well, that's definitely influencing what they're going to be saying. Sometimes there's been some time in between, so they have had time to reflect themselves also on the course. Sometimes you have to deal with, you know, it happened to me a few years ago, for example. This was a program in Antwerp, Belgium, and I see those students 2 times in the same year with 2 different courses with a few months in between. And the second time I saw those students, it was a different group. Something had happened in the group that was not beneficial to the group. I mean, the total chemistry was gone in there, and actually confronted them with it in a sense that, well, guy, what has happened to you guys? Because I don't recognize you even. Obviously, that influences also the feedbacks that they're giving to courses, because there was some bad atmosphere there, some very dominant people with negative, attitudes, and that had evolved over time. And what I'm trying to say is I'm happy always that I have the program management in the middle, because they supposedly know about, you know, how to put the feedbacks into perspectives, right? Because since I create almost all of my courses myself, luckily, I have to say, it's very easy to take it very personal as well, right? The feedbacks in terms of things that didn't work, you put them in there because you're convinced that it will work, and then somebody tells you very bluntly that it was crap, right? And then there's the program directors. Yeah, but it's always just 1 or 2 in the group. They're always negative about everything. No, I can recognize them by the feedback, even because they're anonymous, of course. But so that's always good. But I learn from those feedbacks, I have to say, and this is for me particularly relevant if I work with a new school, a new program, you know, of which I don't know the backgrounds, because MBAs, you could imagine, oh, an MBA is an MBA, isn't it? Well, no. I mean, if I go and teach in Vienna at the Vienna University of Economics in their MBA program, which is a lot of people from Central Europe and Eastern Europe, that's really a different bunch of people than the MBA at Rotterdam School of Management, where I'm sometimes teaching. You know, those are totally different groups. And so, yeah, you need to factor that in somehow or another, right? And that's why the feedbacks are really helpful, you know. And I count myself lucky in a way. I can't compare it with too many others, of course, but that let me say, how should I phrase that? Well, let me just I need to think about that a little bit more before I say something stupid, I guess. In any case, the feedbacks are definitely helping me to shape that in a sense. No, that because that was your question in the end. So it's a continuous loop. I mean, and at the same time, because that's what I wanted to say. I mean, in a way, it helps me also to refresh the material continuously. Right, to go back and say, okay, I'm modifying my master PowerPoint every week. And this is a 17-year development, right? And it's still evolving in a way. And that's based on feedbacks. It's things about that I learn myself. It's about new developments. It's about all of these things. So yeah. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I'm lucky that most of the schools I work with sort of take the feedbacks, I think, with a positive attitude, because there's 1 or 2 schools I've worked with in the past where the feedbacks also became part of almost like a popularity contest. And that's, of course, not healthy. I mean, I really like to work with my students, but it shouldn't be a popularity contest. You know, it's not my objective to become their friend necessarily. If that happens, it's fine, but it's not the objective, right? And if you make those feedbacks and gradings of teachers too important, you get that point, right? Where you say, yeah, I need to do something which they like, because otherwise they will give me a bad grade, right? So,
yes, absolutely. And in our case, it's linked with performance appraisal as full-timers. So as you rightly say, that has the danger that you become the popular educator as opposed to the professional effective motive.
Exactly.
Yeah. Many thanks.
Yeah, great. There's 2 minutes in the session. Now I need to ask the people from the organization if we will be thrown out, or if the people who still have a question can stay around, because there's one Whisper, you have your hand raised, and Ole also still had it one in the chat box. So I would really appreciate if I could still answer those. But Nina, are you still there? Can you let me know whether the session will end? Because there is another session, of course, coming up also in a few minutes.
Yeah, it ends in 2 minutes, so it should be done by now, basically.
Okay, can I stay around with 1 or 2 people just for a few minutes?
Well, I think we need the session. Ayub is calling me right now, so I think we need the Zoom ready in a few minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ole, if you have the possibility, please feel free to reach out, because I definitely want to answer your question if so. And Whisper, the question that you had, if you can also reach out to me and in some way or another, then I would be happy to continue that conversation if that works for you, because apparently
that's fine. Now I'll reach out after the meeting.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. So I wish you a pleasant continuation of the conference.